So this is Jeremy Gilbey talking to Peter Armitage on chain reaction. Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Would you like to say something about yourself?
I could. And just to say that, like you, I'm a graduate of the ESO, 1980, and that tells me it is now 40 years in practice. And that seems as if it's flown by. And we all know the first 50 years are the hardest, so only 10 to go before it comes easy.
So what people have influenced you in your osteopathic career direction the most, and why?
Yeah, so you sent me this question ahead of time, and I had a little time to ponder it, and then I thought perhaps I won't ponder it too much, because one name always leaps out at me, and I'll explain a little bit why, and that's the name of Rollin Becker. Because when I was a student at the ESO and getting into clinical practice there, I came across the 4 articles that were originally published by Rollin Becker in the AAO yearbooks. And I think when I was a student, late 70s this is, there really was actually quite little published osteopathic literature. And a lot of it was American, and these AAO yearbooks were a great resource because they had a lot of very variable sort of articles of all kinds. And Rollin Becker had written these 4 called Diagnostic Touch, Its Principles and Application. And they struck me with tremendous force. In other words, I thought several things on reading them. One is, this sounds more like me, or as it were, the way I'd like to practice than anything else had up to that point. And B, I recognized a kind of comfortable recognition of the spiritual aspect of osteopathy, which is important in my life and in the way I practice. And then I realized I really would like to understand these articles. And I actually wrote a condensation of them because they were very long. They were stretched out over 4. And I wanted to be sure I'd understood it. And so I wrote a condensation of those 4 articles down to about 3-4 pages. And that actually got published in our newsletter of the Society of Osteopaths, which was at that time the postgraduate body of the students of the ESO, because we were a disunited profession at that point. And from writing that condensation of those articles, it really it cemented, if you like, for me, that this was a direction of practice that I was going to go in. And it seemed to me I never much veered from that. And so I put Rollin Becker, whose father was one of Still's associates, professor, who was an anatomist.
Yeah.
And so he stood in a direct line of osteopathic succession, so to speak. So you felt when talking to him and dealing with him that you went back right to the authentic root of osteopathy. And what I found interesting about him was, although he's associated with Dr. Sutherland very much, he started his life in practice, I think, as a fairly conventional osteopath of the type of those days. So I suppose we're talking about the 1940s. And then he realized he was dissatisfied, and he went back and he read Still again and again, cover to cover, so to speak, until he felt he'd got it in his mind. And that was how his take on how he would practice evolved, which was this quiet hands, stilling oneself, observing the mechanism at work, etc. And then he met Sutherland contemporaneously with that. And those two formed, I think, a tremendously powerful bond. And that strain of our thinking and our work is what I followed my entire career.
Excellent. That puts it into a wonderful context. Yeah, I remember those books, those articles as well. They were a great inspiration for me too.
They were, and there wasn't much else published. That's very little, actually.
Also, I never came across your précis.
Yeah, that. Did you ever read it or not?
I never came across it.
No, sorry, I didn't hear that. Yeah, it was published in a fairly obscure publication, the Journal of the Society of Osteopaths. But weirdly, when I went to America, where I went in 1981, I was rather embarrassed to find that I'd been quoted in a published book by, I think it was by Upledger and Retzlaff, when they were both at the Michigan State University College of Osteopathic Medicine. And maybe it was just Retzlaff's book about the cranial sutures. And they picked a quote out of that article and credited it to me. And I realized, oh my God, Rollin Becker ought to have got the credit for that, because it was not an original thought. But anyhow, you can find me credited in an academic textbook in 1981, which was the year after graduation. So I think that's cool, so to speak.
Yes.
If a bit plagiaristic.
So in your own work, how has it evolved and continued to evolve over the years?
Well, I think it's a bit invidious to pick out names. And you asked me for the chief influence or influences, and I gave them. And I'll just sort of preface all of this with saying that many, many other people I feel have influenced the way I work and practice. But if I look at an evolution, it slightly goes along with where I chose to live. Because after graduating, I lived about a year. I was living in London and did start practice in London. But then I decided to go to America. I went and I practiced for a while in Arizona and later in Michigan. And I went and met Rollin Becker and spent time at his practice and all of that. And that was a kind of seminal moment for me. But during that whole American sojourn, I became I would say imbued with some of the sense of America's osteopathy. And after all, it is the home of it. And although many, 90% probably of osteopaths had drifted away simply to the practice of medicine, that cohort of American osteopaths who did practice osteopathy, 10-fingered osteopaths, as they call them in the States, had within them a tremendous resource of kind of competence and willing to tackle all sorts of things. And very early on, I had the privilege of treating an old-time osteopath who came to see me in Phoenix, where I was living, for treatment. And he had, I think he'd been in practice probably the same amount of time as I have now, then 40 years. And he was the one who said to me, osteopathy is for sick people and not just a hitch in your get-along. You know, and I love that phrase. And he had the aim to treat all kinds of illness the way we should, be ambitious with a great breadth of practice. And I think the American osteopaths, because they had that medical training behind them, were able to feel that they could do this. And in those days of relative freedom, which seem to have got eroded into the days we're living now, they were very ambitious with what they would treat and tackle. And that gave them a kind of level of solidity and competence, whatever their mode of practice, that I really appreciated. And I appreciated meeting many of them, not only the big names from the SCTF, as it were, and, you know, the Bob Fulfords, Viola Freimans, Tom Schooley, and others I could name, but also these kind of under the radar DOs who had a great wealth of experience and practice and were eager to impart it to anyone who was interested. And I benefited so much from that, both in Phoenix and later in Michigan, where I was part of a study group. And we used to invite some of the old timers to come and teach us. And that was a great resource. And so that's part of my development. I moved back to England in 1992, right at the start of the SCCO. We were just literally beginning, was invited to join as a faculty member then. And then I guess I moved into that teaching phase of my professional life. And like everyone who teaches, I think we teach what we love to learn, and we improve ourselves greatly and learn more and more as we teach. And the joy of teaching and passing on skills hand to hand, the way it was passed to us, and we pass it on in our turn, is something that has developed my osteopathy no end. You know, I can't even imagine how much benefit I've had from being a teacher and a learner. I love the fact that in some languages, the verb to teach and to learn are actually the same.
Yeah, yeah. Lovely. It's really beautifully expressed. We learn so much from being in a teaching mode, don't we? It takes us back to challenge the basics of what we're doing.
Yes, yes, yes. And the joy of seeing people sort of getting it, getting what you've got, and you've found joy in understanding. And when they get it, it's very, very rewarding. The other thing, of course, I should mention is that I developed from children's clinic work. And 1992 was also the very early days of the OCC. And I joined them at that time as well, and spent 16 years, as I say, as a teaching clinician at the OCC. And that, being a teaching clinician, is another whole dimension of effort and learning and self-improvement and so on that I can't speak too highly of. And I'm still involved with teaching in children's clinics to this day.
That's great, Peter. I think, unfortunately, we have to bring it to a halt there.
Do we?
Thank you
My
so
time
much.
flies when you're having fun.
Thank you. That was a lovely exposition. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and thank you, Peter, for your great work.
And thank you for the chance to speak to you.